I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. And our guest today is Jim Barger. Jim. You're the co-author of a book.
Yes.
This book right here that I tried so hard to get my hands on for so long. I had to petition Kyle over at Bitter Southerner for so long to get a copy. This thing has been selling like crazy. Like they can't keep it in.
Yeah, the first printing sold out that was supposed to last a year sold out in 2 months. I think that's there's demonstrates the interest people have in the president.
Yeah. It was not just the president, right? I feel like, we can talk about presidents and things like that because presidents have like this larger than life thing. But I feel like reading this book, you really get a chance to get a sense to know this man, the soul, if you will, more than any particular title. I just, President Carter has just always been this guy, at least certainly in my life, we're talking before we started recording, as a Southern man, as a guy who kind of grew up, in that tradition. He's just always kind of been in this liminal space where it's like, this is who he is. And to be able to read a book like this, which I love, like this is probably not going to go on. There's a whole bunch of fishing books right behind me. And this is probably not ever going to go onto that shelf because I just love this thing so much. I have to tell you.
Thank you.
And for those of y'all, for those of y'all listen, the book we're talking about here is Jimmy Carter, Rivers and Dreams, Rods, Reels, and Peace Deals, plus the one that got away. This is fun. Jim, before we start talking about this thing, you want to introduce yourself and we'll kind of go from there?
Sure. So my name is Jim Barger Jr., and I am an attorney by trade, but I'm also a writer. I've been a writer my whole life, and I've been a fly angler my entire life. I got to know the president early in my life. He came down to where I live on the small barrier island off the coast of Georgia, and he would retreat there as governor and then as president. So I was about 6 years old when I met him the first time. And that didn't seem very uncommon for folks down here. He was a guy who he and Rosalynn came down quite a bit, and kids, families knew him. So it was not till later that I realized how unique that was, that situation.
I never had the honor of meeting the president. And I was a guest on a podcast last year, and I was talking about history and so forth. And one of the questions they asked was like, hey, if you could sit down and have dinner with any one person in history, who would you talk to? And I said, Jimmy Carter, all day long. Just not even a question. But I've got friends in Georgia. My very good friend, Chris Barr, he's a national park ranger out there. And
what park is he?
He's now in South Carolina. Okay. He's now at Reconstruction Era National Park out in Beaufort.
Beaufort. Yeah.
I got to tell you, Chris, I'll go on a side tangent here for a second. The work the National Park Rangers do to tell the story of this country. And Chris, I've seen a lot of them. Chris is the best of the best. I've never seen anybody like him. But he met the president, and he would just talk about how easy it was to get to meet him and just how approachable he was, But at 6 years old, I'm guessing you're not really thinking about that so much. Is like, here's just another guy.
He was just a parent who walked into the room, when we were all being babysat. Now, I do recall thinking, knowing that this is the president, and seeing the Secret Service agents and realizing that was a unique thing. Years later, when I met him and spent time with him again, I didn't think he would remember that, but he certainly said that he did, and he seemed to be genuine, and he always, he was the guy who promised never to tell a lie. He said he remembered meeting me as a young man, and that was special too.
When you actually, so I have to ask you, I've never met a president yet, or maybe, no, not yet. Maybe some people I know already have, but when you, as an adult, and would engage with President Carter, was there an aura that you were talking to the president, or was there familiarity? Like,
he certainly had an aura around him.
Okay.
And you say, and so did Rosalynn. But when you say he was, people say he was approachable and easy. He definitely was, but he also had these piercing blue eyes, and he would fix them on you and not let go. in a way that was a bit unnerving, because he demanded a lot of himself. He committed as a young man to learn something new every day, and he did that for his entire life. And he also had this situation when he was when he was in the Navy and was being auditioned by Admiral Rickover to be part of the nuclear program. And the Admiral was famous for really putting people through grueling interviews. And in fact, would set up the chair so it would slide forward so you're always falling out of your chair while you're talking to him. And he would ask just random things to find out what you knew, whether it was about opera or it wasn't just about nuclear physics. So the last question Carter got from him was, at the Naval Academy, did you do your very best? And this is a guy who was in the top 10% of his class at the Naval Academy. And Carter had to think about it, and he said, no, sir. And then Rickover said, maybe paraphrasing this, why not? And that question haunted Jimmy Carter for the rest of his life. He was always trying to do his very best. And you could see that when you talk to him, he was trying to wonder if you're the type of person who does your very best. So, I said he was definitely approachable, but this was a very tough man, a man of the Great Depression, last president we ever had that grew up without running water, grew up without indoor plumbing, whose days started at 4 a.m. and went into the nighttime working in the fields. So Carter was a different breed than I would say any president we've had in my lifetime.
The thing that comes to my mind is you're telling me about this story, and I think I've heard the story before about with
Rickover,
interrogation with Rickover, right? Carter has always seems to be me, and I was born in 1977, right? So I don't really remember Carter's presidency as a child. He was kind of floating around as I grew up, but I came to know him more as a man, as you become more aware of the world around you, things like that. The thing that always kind of came to me was the fierce integrity of President Carter, right? And just, really my exposure to him in real time was his work, Habitat with Humanity, and the works that he was doing as an ambassador and things like that. I'll tell you, Jim, I've got two young boys. My boys are 17 and 12 right now. My younger boy's about to be 13 next month. And there's this entire debate going on right now, if you watch social media or read anything right now, about masculinity and the virtues of men and all this stuff, right? And there seems to be, in my mind, or pretty apparent, that on one side of the aisle, you've got these idea of these hyper masculine guys, these like bullheaded dudes. And when I look at the late president, what I want for my own boys is to model that, where it's like this first and foremost empathetic human being who worked his tail off, right? Committed to education, service of his country, right?
Yeah.
And I like to think that he did do the best he could, I think at a lot of times, I think here's the thing I love about your book, because I think that as a historian, we are desperate need of reconceptualizing Carter's presidency. His life, I actually think he is one of the great presidents. When you look at what he had to encounter as president, there's this there was always this almost cliche. It's an easy way out, Jim, when people say, oh, he's a good man, but wasn't a great president. I'm like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You look at what he had to encounter, what he had to deal with. Tell me, Jim, if there's another man on the planet who could have done a better job than this man, because I don't see it.
No, he made mistakes, and people want to talk about the mistakes.
Absolutely.
But you know why people are able to talk about the mistakes? Because he admitted them.
Absolutely.
And we have presidents and leaders and senators and congressmen now who they don't ever admit their mistakes. And that's, if you want to, I hate to frame these things in terms of masculinity, except to address this topic that people are using, but
yes, sir.
there's nothing more bold and human, than to admit your mistakes. It demonstrates somebody who's strong in their character and strong in the knowledge of who they are, and tough as nails. You have to be tough to admit your mistakes. It's a very adolescent thing to not admit your mistakes. It shows a lack of human growth. But you want to talk about what people conceive of as masculine. We haven't had a president anywhere close in my lifetime, or even maybe going all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt. Carter, he was first to go down Bull Sluice Rapid in a tandem kayak, dangerous, deadly river. He camped in some of the most harrowing places in the Amazon and the Black Canyon. He was an avid angler, avid hunter, avid woodworker. He built all of the furniture in his home. I mean, when I visited him in his home, we were there seeing the furniture that he made. So these folks who duff around on the golf course can't even come close to that type of what is perceived to be masculine. But the really interesting thing is, I think it has something to do with his upbringing. He had a very fierce, demanding father who was a farmer, who expected him to be up in the morning. One of the things he had to do first thing in the morning was go over and change his great aunt's bedpan at her house, and then come back, feed the chickens, do all these things. Carter always remembered one day that he was sick and that everyone else was out in the peanut fields, and his father came home berating him for, taking the easy way out. But meanwhile, he had a mother who was, she was a midwife. She went and delivered most of the babies in their community. And also to remember and realize, Carters were white landowners in an all-black community. He didn't have no one else in archery was white except for his family. And so his mother would go in, and it didn't matter whether it was black or white, in a highly segregated world, delivered these babies. And she accepted people sometimes in the front room against the mores of the time, which would make President Carter's father very angry. But he had to defer to Miss Lillian because she was tough. And she earned the right by who she was to have her guests in the front house. But then the third person that raised him was a woman named Rachel Clark. I don't know if you know about Rachel, but
no,
she was a black sharecropper, and President Carter considered her to be his third parent, and he spent many nights in that home on a pallet on the floor instead of in his own home. And it was Rachel Clark who really taught him to be a fisherman. And he said that Rachel Clark he still at the end of his life said Rachel Clark was the finest angler he'd ever known. So they would go fish together. He learned a lot of the so-called masculine skills from this female sharecropper that was his neighbor.
I love to hear that, Jim. That is, and I think it's through stories like this we get to get a sense of like who these people really are, whether we're talking about the president or Rosalynn or anybody else. And I want to talk about a bunch of them if we can today. I don't want to give the whole book away by any means because I want people to go out and buy this book as fast as they can. I may have to buy a second one just so I can show it off on my bookshelf. But just like, look what I've got. I've already been bragging to my friends that I have this. This has already made the rounds at work.
Nice.
I promise you. I was like, look what I have. There are folks I work with who were big Carter fans and should be. But I want to ask you about this. How does this book, this fishing biography of Carter's life, if you will, I don't quite know how to say it. How does this come to life? Because you're the co-author here.
Yeah.
Dr. Carlton Hicks is part of this story as well.
Absolutely.
How does this story come to play? How does this book
Well, it was very organic in its conception. It was 2020. So, I'll take you back a little bit. I'll take you a lot way back. 19
Go all the way back. We got time.
We'll go back to Carter. It's 1980, and Carter has lost the election, and he's down. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, or I don't know about these things, but I think it's fair to say, in the colloquial term, he was depressed. He was beaten down. Many of the things that he had accomplished, people had ignored. Many of them he had accomplished as president. He knew that they, having done them, were going to cost him the presidency, but that they would pay dividends for our generation and beyond, like the Alaska Lands Act. They burned Carter in effigy over the Alaska Lands Act. He preserved 100 acres. And at that time, in the time that he did it, they put up pictures at the Alaska State Fair of Jimmy Carter and the Ayatollah Khomeini, and you could pay to throw bottles at these pictures. And there was a massive pile of glass under Carter's and a small under the Ayatollahs. And this is while the hostages were being held. But he did it anyway, and he got it pushed through. And many years later, the story in the book about how the people of Alaska changed their mind and realized what a benefit it was to them for what he did. So I won't give that story away, but it's a very touching story in the book. But he had done all of these things. The Panama Canal Treaty, he got blistered for the Panama Canal Treaty.
Mm-hmm.
And every president before had tried to and knew that it was something, Republican and Democrat alike, that we needed to divest ourselves of the canal, and that it would save untold lives and potential conflicts in Central America to do that. And yet he had advisors telling him this is political suicide. And he reached across the aisle, and Senator Howard Baker, who was a Republican, who was running for president and probably would have won the nomination for president, the Republican nomination, over Reagan, if he hadn't gone along with Carter and pushed the Panama Canal Treaty. I worked for Senator Baker, my first job as a lawyer, and I remember him telling me that when I asked him about his relationship with Carter, his response was that Jimmy Carter was relentless. I will never forget the way he said that word, relentless. He said it like he was chewing on a dry piece of meat. And he knew it. It cost both. It may have been the thing that cost both men the presidency, because Reagan pounced on them about the treaty and given away. And so he first defeated Baker, and then he defeated Carter. But there were a lot of other issues going on. But you can imagine leaving the White House thinking, I just got rejected soundly by the American people, and I've done all of these things. I did the best I could. I did my very best, and I have accomplished things for posterity, but, they're promising to roll them back, and what's going to happen? He and Rosalynn and Amy, in the May of that year, just a few years after he left the White House, they packed up in a camper van. And they drove all the way up to western Pennsylvania to Spruce Creek, where their friend Wayne Harpster had a dairy farm. Testament to Carter's ability to reach across party lines. Wayne is still a adamant Republican. But they went up there, and he and Carter were best friends, and they fished the creek for a week. The rest of their family joined them. And at the end of the week, President Carter and Rosalynn climbed up onto a hill overlooking the pasture there where all the dairy cattle were and the stream goes through. And they started to think about and talk about what they would do with the rest of their lives. And, that was the germ of the idea of the Carter Center. There's also a story that he tells later where he woke up with the blueprint for the Carter Center and what it would do. But it was in that trip that he kind of got his groove back and realized what he could do, what they could do together. Well, they went every year after that in May to Spruce Creek, never missing a year. And my friend Carlton Hicks always went with him. Carlton is from here, St. Simons. He's been in St. Simons. He's been the eye doctor here since the early 60s. And he volunteered on Carter's campaigns, all of them. beginning with the first failed gubernatorial campaign. And he's spent many nights in the White House, hung out with the Carters and Willie Nelson, has just these fantastic stories that I had always heard. So from him at home, and so in fast forward to 2020, and the pandemic is getting into full effect. There's shutdowns, and we're all complying with the shutdown. The Carters can't make it to Spruce Creek. That it's clear for their age that it's not advisable for them to do that. So we decided to go anyway. Dr. Hicks, my father, Jim Barger Sr., and myself, and another friend of ours, Tom Sayer, we drove up we got up at 4 o'clock in the morning and drove the 13 hours. We put our masks on when we stopped at the gas stations, but otherwise we didn't stop and see anybody. We went straight to the cabin at Spruce Creek, and we fished while we were there for about a week. And Dr. Hicks and Wayne would tell these wonderful stories about all their trips around the world with the Carters fishing. And at one point in the trip, Dr. Hicks brought out a bamboo fly rod, and inscribed on the fly rod, it said in black cursive, James Earl Carter. And he brought out a box of flies, an old tin box of flies, and said, these are the flies that President Carter gave to me before we came on the trip. And they're all tied by him. These are his hand-tied flies. Who wants to take a go with his rod and one of these flies and see if you can catch a fish in Spruce Creek? So we all took turns and caught fish in his honor. It became sort of a tradition that we've done many years since then. I think we may have missed 1 year, but over the course of those trips and sitting on that porch at Spruce Creek, Dr. Hicks and I told him, we got to write these stories down. We got to make it a book, even if it's just a book for your kids and my kids and whoever else. We need to do this. And so I happened to mention it one day that I was thinking about that to my editors and publishers at The Bitter Southerner, because I wrote I'm a contributing writer for them, and they pounced on it and said they wanted to publish it. So that's how it came together.
Now, I have to tell you, in my line of work here with the podcast, and certainly as a scholar, I see so many biographies come through. My friend Lindsay Travinsky just wrote a tremendous one about John Adams, but I have rarely seen the excitement for a book like this that comes around. And I think, again, this is such a Jim, it just feels like such a personal read to me. When you're kind of reading the stories through Carlton's voice, through your own, and of course they're all centered around Jimmy and Rosalynn. I want to ask you, we're talking about the Bitter Southern. You and I are both from the South, right? And proudly so. It's a thing for me that wherever it is that I go, right? It's I'll tell you, I did my graduate school up in Minnesota. That's where I did my PhD. It was really the first time I felt like being from the South was like being from Mars. It was like people up there just looked at us like we're from some other country. Like wasn't a lot of Southern guys up there. It was me and one of the professors. One of my professors, she's from North Carolina. But aside from that, it was us. But I wonder, you think about Jimmy Carter, and certainly a Southerner is one of the immediate, I think, first and foremost, tremendous faith, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But like, how does his identity as a Southerner kind of manifest in like not just his presidency, but like himself as an angler? Because I think as I started to come, I've only picked up fly fishing since I come out to Colorado about a year and a half ago. So I'm kind of wondering, is there something about being from Georgia? Is it manifest in the way that he fishes or looks at the world, or like, how does him being from the South affect the way that he went about the rest, engaging the world around him?
Yeah, well, I would say he was, in particular, he was a rural Southerner,
Yes, sir.
And being a rural Southerner, folks from other parts of the world and other parts of the country can sort of identify if you're from a tiny little town. that depends on farming and that has a hunting and fishing tradition, as many of the small southern towns do, and a lot of towns out west as well, the Midwest, and even in the far in Northeast. But yeah, he was a southerner, and he came from this rural tradition that involved, hunting and fishing both as such way of getting your sustenance, particularly coming out of the Great Depression, but also as recreation and communion with nature. And it may seem strange, but it's still a tradition where we're from that you kind of define your worth by your ability to catch fish. If you can't catch fish and you're from a small southern town, then, and you've got problems. People look at you funny. And that transcends gender. Talking about Rachel Clark was this great angler that taught him how to fish. And it not fly fishing, but meat fishing, coming back with enough fish to feed your family. And women in the South were frequently the ones who caught the fish to put on the table. Before I became a lawyer, I did my master's degree study. My first graduate study was in Southern Studies. I got a master's degree in Southern Studies from the University of Mississippi. But I spent most of my time living on another barrier island just north of us, Sapelo Island, which is inaccessible by car. You have to take a ferry to get there. And it has one of the last intact Gullah Geechee communities on the coast. And I lived with a family there, the Bailey family. In fact, if you haven't read this book, you want to write this down and read this book. Cornelia Bailey, who was my mentor, Cornelia Bailey, she wrote a book in the 80s called God, Dr. Buzzard, and the Bolito Man. And it's about her life as a saltwater Geechee on Sapelo Island. And I had the privilege of being with her every morning when she would write it in longhand on this yellow legal pad and read over it with her and talk about it with her. And then I would go out and visit with the basket makers and the fish net makers and all the different craftspeople in the community. But there was one family there, large family, the largest family with the most kids at the time, and a woman named Mary Bailey. Son is a good friend of mine, actually having a very storied NFL career, and I'm having dinner with him and his wife right after this because they've moved back here. Alan Bailey, he played for the Chiefs and then he played for the Falcons. His mother was the best angler on all of Sapelo because she was feeding those kids. And she was going to get that. And if you saw Mary Bailey, and this is true today, I wouldn't want to embarrass her, but if you saw her at a fishing hole at a particular time, particular day, you might want to write that down because that's where the fish are going to be, the tides and the conditions. So, I think this is a long answer to your question, but I think Carter recognized that early on in his life that this is one of the ways you demonstrate your worth, but it's also one of the ways you demonstrate and commune with the earth and commune with creation, commune with God ultimately, which, is his barometer. So, yeah, I think it's incredibly important to Carter. He didn't play golf. He didn't care about winning games. He played tennis. I will say that he was a highly competitive tennis player. His parents on that farm, they scratched out a dirt tennis court and people would come and play, which seems odd, doesn't it? But it was a thing. He played tennis, he jogged, mostly he fished. And he also bird hunted. He kept bird dogs. When he was I'm a bird dog guy. I have bird dogs. When he was in the White House, he kept his string of bird dogs back in Plains, and he had somebody else watch over him, take care of him, so when he got back, he'd be able to have his bird dog. He was Southern to the core. And it also informed, the other thing that it informed about President Carter is he recognized the horrors that are also attendant to our region, I think.
Yes,
and as a result of that, his implicit understanding that the farmland that he owned had been taken from the indigenous people not that many generations back from him, and by force, and that people had died being forced out in that exodus. And he implicitly also understood that thereafter his ancestors had enslaved people and that there was a legacy that had to be overcome. And I think that's another one of those things, going back to your so-called, this so-called masculinity that people are talking about all the time. He recognized he had a serious debt to pay, and it didn't bother him to admit it. And I think that's something that you hear over and over again right now is, I don't want to take on the debts of my ancestors. I don't even want to admit the debts or admit the wrongs. And it wasn't just a matter of paying a debt. I think President Carter recognized that, the only way we can progress as a society is to move forward and acknowledge these things and try to change them. And so his identity as a Southerner informed every bit of that. His desire to create peace, his desire to bring people together, they were all based on tacit acknowledgement of who he was and how he was grounded in history and in a particular place.
Jim, we were just talking, we're talking about the idea of fishing to provide for your family. You can't see it up here, but my grandfather's remains are actually inside this creation of a catfish. My entire family comes from running trot lines on the Kentucky Lake, Tennessee River, and so forth. I know you're familiar with these areas and such, and I certainly relate to that. Why fly fishing? Did Jimmy ever talk about why fly? Because so much of the book talks about, it talks about with the fly rod in his hand. What was the appeal for him for this particular style of fishing? He goes all over the world. They're fishing for all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Chapter on Patagonia. I'm dying to get down there. I need this yellow Dorado in my life. More particular, on the wall. Actually, as soon as that happens, all these books are going to go away. It's going to be a picture of me gripping and grinning.
There you go.
But why a fly rod? Why did Jimmy respond? Why did he take up the fly?
Well, I think I've read a lot of his writings and I've discussed it with him as well. One of the things, I think there are two things that are happening there. One, President Carter loved to challenge himself and to be challenged, and he said this is a paraphrase, but in his book, An Outdoor Journal, which was published, I think, in the early to mid-90s, he pointed out that there needs to be some difficulty and some potential for failure for it to be of interest to him. He wanted to try the hard things. And there's a lot of that in the book about the one that got away, which is also a metaphor, obviously, for what got away from him politically. But he sought the hard things. And, fly fishing there's a particular skill set that has to be developed. And in many ways with fly fishing, you're deliberately feeding a fish. Anglers talk about feeding the fish. You're putting, it's not so much there's an attractant in the water that's drawing the fish in. You're looking at the fish, you're trying to find the fish, and you're trying to put that food directly in the line of sight of that fish in a way that it looks. And so it can be a lot more challenging. Now, I'm sure you figured out, as I have, I like to catch fish myself. So, and I have found that in many circumstances, fly fishing is the best method. I mean, it didn't originate to try to challenge people. It originated in the trout streams, the chalk streams in England, and because you couldn't get the tiny fly on the water any other way. And then we've adapted it to saltwater angling. And I'm sure you probably have experienced this as an angler. Once you get into it, you keep wanting to try to catch different species and you keep moving. So I think he wasn't much different than the rest of us as anglers, in the sense that he got hooked on the idea of touching these creatures, engaging with these creatures, learning about them, learning about their habitats, and it becomes addictive, like bird watching or any other type of thing where you're trying to commune with nature. I think fly fishing is, and also once you get past the point in where you are fishing to sustain yourself and you realize, okay, I've got to release, if I'm going to make this be something that is sustainable, I'm going to have to release these fish or not fish at all. And fly fishing lends itself to catch and release. So I think it's a natural evolution.
Yeah, I can't help but think about the thoughts that President Carter had, because I find that when I'm fly fishing, the aspect of fishing, it's demanding, not in a negative way, but it requires my concentration, right? And then in doing so, I'm able to, it's this odd thing about where I'm having to concentrate on what I'm doing and therefore freeing up my mind to actually think about other things. And this weird kind of, there's this odd release when it comes from fly fishing. We can't talk about Jimmy, though, without talking about Rosalynn, right? She also, throughout the book, you talk about her.
Yeah.
She's fishing alone.
Yes.
What is her relationship to fishing? Seems like she is just as very capable herself and enjoys the pursuit. Am I right?
Absolutely. She is very passionate, or was a very passionate fly angler. And, you hear this said especially by fly fishing instructors. I've never had a, actual course in fly fishing, but I know guys and women who teach. And instructors tend to say women are easier to teach when it comes to fly fishing, casting in particular, because they don't force it the same way that men try to force it. The rod does all the work. We want to just beat it against the wind, and really the tip of the rod is in letting the line unfurl and come back again. Whether that's unique to female gender or not, that is anecdotal. I hear that all the time from people who teach fly fishing. But President Carter readily admitted that she might have been the better angler than he was, but he was so fiercely competitive, he always wanted to beat her. They were competitive with one another, very. But and Rosalynn was very competitive too. I remember sitting at their house talking about while writing the book, and President Carter and I were talking about fishing, and the pattern of our discussion was going back and forth between the two of us, as that tends to happen. And she was sitting right next to him. And she finally just broke in. And as I said, he had this way of locking you with his eyes. You couldn't really look away. Normally I would want to bring everybody in, but she sat there probably for about 5 minutes and wasn't part of the conversation. And she finally just broke in and said, I was a fine angler myself. Dr. Hicks was with me, and she said, wasn't I, Carlton? And he said, oh, yes. Their fishing days were, the sad part about that statement was it was implicit that their fishing days were over. But she was a fine fly angler, and she enjoyed trout fishing, I think, the most. And she was good at spay casting for salmon. When you stop and think about some of the things they did, he was, I want to say 93, and she was 89, maybe, the year she was turning 90, or maybe I'm getting these, but they were in their late 80s, early 90s when they went to fish for Atlantic salmon in Russia along the Arctic Circle, and it's not getting dark until 2 o'clock in the morning. And President Carter's the first one in and last one out at 2 a.m. And at that age, and they're standing in the river, between the two of them, they caught, I think it was 50 Atlantic salmon in those 5 days. So that's, I don't know if you ever caught an Atlantic salmon, but they fight harder than all of the Pacific species, and casting for them is brutal. You're standing in that water casting over and over and over again, just the casting alone. But if you hook a good Atlantic salmon, it might take you into your backing several times, 30-minute, hour-long fight. Can you imagine doing that at 90? Can you imagine?
I can't imagine doing that at 47,
Can you imagine your
Jim?
parents doing that? Your mother out there? My mother's tough, but she wouldn't be doing that. In Russia, after all the travel they had to do to get there and into the wilderness, and and camping along the riverside. They're not staying in some posh lodge. So these people were tough, and they were passionate about fishing. It wasn't just a side thing. or just something that they did. It was an obsession in some ways.
Well, you talk about Russia here.
Mm-hmm.
We already talked about Patagonia a second ago. We're talking about Colorado. Okay, one of the things I absolutely love about the book, the way the book is laid out, you're flipping through the book and it's like Rocky Mountains, Argentina. It's just like, I read this book and it feels like I'm on a quest with the president as well. Did the president have a favorite place to fish or a favorite fish he enjoyed the most?
Well, of all the trips that they went on, he said that trip that I just described for Atlantic salmon was his favorite. And then another trip to Russia on the opposite end, on Russia, in Kamchatka, where they fished for wild rainbows. You catch a 30-inch rainbow, which is like, climbing Everest or something. It's the thing that trout anglers aspire to. And that's one of the places where you can do it without, it's not an uncommon thing to make that happen there as it is in other places. So those two trips, I think, were his favorite of all of the trips in the book. He loved saltwater angling, but I think trout fishing was his favorite. He went on more trout fishing trips than any others. He went every year to Spruce Creek. Spruce Creek was definitely large in his life. It was one of the few places he could retreat. When he was president, they went to Spruce Creek, and it carried him all the way through to the end of his life, those trips to Spruce Creek. So I don't think he ever said, this is my favorite species, but I think trout in general, and then, of course, the Andromedas fish, those were big to him, too.
We talk about yourself, Dr. Hicks, Rosalynn. I'm interested, and you talk about this in the book, certainly, but I think one of the things our listeners would be interested in hearing is like, Carter had these amazing foreign policy, things that he did during his presidency. Can you talk about how fishing factored into the president's foreign policy?
Well, there are a couple of times when he was president that he tried to use fishing. The most sort of, I guess, it's not very well known that he tried to do this. It looms large in his presidency. During the Camp David peace accords, he arranged for a fishing trip for Sadat and Begin. And these men were at each other's throat. Constituencies, the generals that were with them on both sides, and the aides were all so much at each other's throat, to a point where, he had to separate everybody and just go back and forth. And that's it still is what's taught in mediation techniques. He did those techniques that Carter developed during the peace accords. But he also thought, well, we can get together and do some things where we won't be talking about what we're doing, and maybe we can hit that moment of Zen that you were talking about, where you're concentrating so much on reading the water, finding, making sure that you can get the cast, get the proper drift, mend your line, set the hook, land the fish, that you don't really have time to think about the things that are bothering you and that are occupying your mental space and that are causing you stress. And then, as you pointed out, what tends to happen is your subconscious does start to go into those things and solve them in a much more logical and dispassionate way. It's what I have found. I think President Carter was hoping for that moment with these two guys. But it got so heated that he had to cancel the trip. But in a stroke of brilliance, instead of taking them fishing, he took them to the battlefield. He took them to go to Gettysburg, and it was at Gettysburg that they were at such a low moment. He thought everybody was going to go home and there wouldn't be peace. But on that battlefield, walking that field, and all of those generals and the leaders on both sides had studied that battle, as you would in military history, and so they knew everything about it. And they started to chat about the battle instead of the other things that they were going through. At some point, it looked like there was a little bit of light there, but Sadat still wasn't budging. He wasn't really, he was cold, or he seemed cold, until Carter and the group realized that he was just so deep in thought, and he started to recite the Gettysburg Address from memory to that group. And everybody realized, okay, we've got to go back to the drawing board. So fishing was the idea that didn't work in that sense, but it morphed into another idea that paid off for the president. I'd say, Carter used fishing more in his post-presidency work than he did during the presidency, though. There are more anecdotes about that we uncovered than we did during his presidency.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah.
Because his presidency is, he was president for 4 years. Had the better part of 40 years since then, maybe more than, in which he lived. Can we talk about the role that fishing plays after 1980? And is that entirely a recreational thing? Is that a relationship thing? Like, what role does fishing play in the lives of Jimmy and Rosalynn, in the last second half of their lives?
It was very large. I mean, it was a private thing, but it was very large in their lives. They did multiple fishing trips a year. And they were so busy with the Carter Center and with Habitat that, I think about my life today and how many fishing trips I'm able to get together with my friends, and I'm not nearly as even remotely as highly scheduled as they were. And yet they never failed to do these trips year in, year out, multiple trips with the same group of people. So when you talk about relationships, I think it very much was relational. Now, I will say that I think President Carter would have done those trips by himself. So, I think it is also, he had a passion for doing this. And then he gathered a small group of people around him to do it with him. And they were not influential people. He wasn't going out necessarily with, he was friends with Ted Turner, and he was friends with all of these other highly influential people. He was friends with the King Hussein. But he went fishing with his buddy who was a small optometrist in a small town. And he went fishing with his buddy who was a dock builder in North Carolina. And he went fishing with their wives. And there was one billionaire that came on the trips, but that member of the group ultimately decided to give his entire fortune away because of his relationship with Jimmy Carter. So, and all that's outlined in the book. They just loved to fish together. And he also, in his diplomatic work and in his work eradicating diseases and other things, he was always looking and thinking like, well, if I'm going over to this place, is there fishing to be had? And vice versa, he did use fishing to accomplish diplomatic things. And when he went to fish in Venezuela twice, he spent those fishing trips. He was invited by businessman Gustavo Cisneros, who was, arguably one of the richest people in South America at the time. And yet he was he represented one half of a pretty bitter battle for the Venezuelan economy and government, which on the other side of the aisle you had Hugo Chavez. And somehow Jimmy Carter was friends with both of them and developed friendships with both of them, recognized the faults that both of them had, severe faults, recognized faults in their ideology, their respective ideologies. One is trying to collect wealth in one person and establish power through wealth, and the other one is trying to turn around and turn over all wealth to the state in a way that was, not productive in Carter's mind either. So he wanted to bridge those gaps, and he went down there on two separate fishing trips to do that. And one of the camp, he went to an Amazonian camp to fish for a golden dorado, no, for peacock bass. And that same fishing camp that was owned by Cisneros had been a year or two prior raided by Chavez's people and turned upside down. And here he was doing these trips. He spent these days with Cisneros fishing, and then he would go back and visit with Chavez and do his sort of same type of diplomacy that he did at Camp David, talking to one on their ground and going to the other on their ground. And he took his fishing buddies with him.
I gotta tell you, the chapters on Argentina and Venezuela in the book had my mouth agape as I'm reading through them, some of these stories. And I don't want to give away the book, but there is so much stuff there that I was like, you've got to be kidding me. He was such, I don't want to say canny operator.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because that kind of lends, it's not the right words here, but his ability to go back and forth between people who are wildly different and befriend both of them.
He had an extremely high emotional intelligence, as people define it today. I don't think they talk about it in this. People trusted him. They trusted him. They trusted his motives, and whether they agreed with him or not. And he could connect on a human level with people in a way that made them want to see his vision and see it through. And one of the things that, talking about his faith, before he had any opportunity or thought of becoming a presidential candidate, he did, as a lot of people in his faith tradition, Southern Baptist tradition, that he ultimately moved out of Southern Baptist and he went to the Maranatha Baptist because of their refusal to accept black members. But he was a missionary in the Southern Baptist Church as a grown man. He went to cities in the Northeast, and this is something that was done, and they pair you up with a person. Paired with a guy named I forget his first name, but his last name is Cruz, Eloise Cruz. His name was Cruz. He was Cuban American. And Carter was very timid in his faith at that point in his life, and he did not really feel comfortable doing this, going door to door and sharing his faith with strangers, which is an odd thing to do. A lot of us would question whether it's the right way to do it or not now, maybe. But, he was sharing his faith openly and honestly, and to anyone who would listen, door to door. And Cruz was just really good at it. And Jimmy Carter said he wasn't. And they would bunk together. They didn't know each other. They were just paired up. But he asked Cruz one time, what is it about your faith that makes it so easy to share it with people, and people so receptive to hearing your story and your faith, regardless of whether they adopt it or not? And Cruz told him, and this went with Carter the rest of his life, and you can see it in his relationships. And it goes back to me telling you how he would lock you with his eyes. He said, I have two loves in my heart at all times. One is for God, and one is for whoever is right in front of me. And Carter took that like do your very best, and he took it everywhere he went. So if you happened to be the person right in front of him, that's where he directed his love. And I think it worked for him. People who knew Carter loved him back, and they were highly devoted to him and saw that same vision. And, he was peddling peace. He was peddling something that ultimately I think all humans crave, even the ones who revel in fighting and discord. I think we all crave peace. I think that's one of the reasons why people are so fascinated by Jimmy Carter right now, is because he embodies that sort of state of peace and desire for peace, mental peace, emotional peace, peace with the people immediately around you, but then world peace.
Jim, I can't help but think about his place in the presidency, this man of peace that Jimmy Carter was, and find that right now there's an ideological opposite for him sitting in the White House. And I've thought more and more recently about, like, what presidents would be ideal in a time like this. Public lands, Theodore Roosevelt would be wonderful. But, Jimmy Carter, you look at his work in expanding and protecting landscapes, species, all of this also seems to come through as a result of his relationship with the water, with fish, with, his religion as well. And it's like the work that the man did from 77 to 81, continues to pay dividends.
Yeah.
It feels like to me.
Oh my gosh. I mean, when we see what's happening to the Park Service, it just breaks my heart. I know it would break his heart, because no president, no human being in American has done more to preserve lands and recognize the value of the Park Service than Jimmy Carter. If he didn't do anything else, and even taking into account his lasting peace treaties, the lands that he protected are going to be his lasting legacy. Those trees are continuing to sequester carbon. Everything that's, these landscapes are doing to save the earth from what we're doing to it. And at the same time, it's the biggest money maker our country has. Our country makes $55 billion off of the National Park Service, and the budget's like, what, $3.5 billion? It's crazy what this is as a business, that he has left, in addition to just but he doubled the size of our national parks. He created 39 different new national parks. He preserved over 50 million acres with the Antiquities Act. The only president that did more than that under the Antiquities Act was Roosevelt. And he wrote the act, creating these monuments. Land is the idea that land can be a monument is our greatest sort of monuments that we could have. And then he preserved 150 million acres with the Alaskan Land Act, as we talked about, against his political better interests. And he created our nation's super fund to clean up all of the hazardous wastes that poison our most marginalized communities. He doubled the size of Redwood National Forest. Those trees were under threat because of adjacent logging in the waterways that feed those trees were being polluted, and it was going to, the existing park trees were going to be lost. Instead, he went ahead and doubled down on that park, saved all of those trees and the waterways that feed them. These are things that people don't even realize about Carter. They don't talk about him as much as they talk about either the Iran hostage crisis or the price of gas or the amazing inflation that they were living through at the time, the interest rates as high as 20%, and things that he was struggling with. And he struggled with some of the same stuff we're going through right now. I mean, Russia was invading Afghanistan then unilaterally, and he stood strong against them. He did a grain embargo that he knew would be his political downfall. I mean, those were his people, the farmers of America. And it was a mistake, and he later admitted it. Because it didn't work, because we didn't foresee the fact that Argentina and some of these other countries Ukraine, that Russia would build up its grain ability when the USSR would, when it still had Ukraine. So, we think about all those things that plagued his presidency, the energy crisis and everything else, but nobody thinks about the fact or really talks about or highlights the fact that he changed the American landscape more than any other president. And that has outlived him. It will outlive you. It will outlive me. They can fire all the park rangers they want to. That land is still going to be there. It may be, extraction companies may come in there and try to destroy it. All sorts of bad things may happen to it. But those parks are what make America great. And he made them. So, I'll end with that part with this to say, that house where I visited with him in Plains. It's the same house that he built to raise his children. It's just a very modest house where all of his furniture was. After they died, Rosalynn and Jimmy left that house, their principal asset, to the National Park Service, and it's going to be a national park. Nobody cared more about national parks than Carter did. He had a spiritual tie to Teddy Roosevelt in that way. And he honored Teddy Roosevelt by creating Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota. That was one of Carter's parks. Painted Canyon is there because Carter designated it as a park. So, yeah, my heart goes out to everybody who works in national parks, but my heart goes out to the American people because our parks are more part of the fabric of who we are than the flag itself or any other symbol of America. Mountains, the streams, and even our urban parks where our history is housed. As you talking about your friend in Beaufort, there's Martin Luther King Jr. Park in Atlanta that Jimmy Carter created. All sorts of urban parks all up and down the New England and where the original colonies were. And that's where we have our history. I mean, you can print as many American flags in China as you want. You can put people's faces on them. You can do all that stuff. Nothing's more American than our national parks. Jimmy Carter understood that.
Yeah. Jim, the last thing I keep thinking as you're telling me all this, and, it came to mind as I was reading the book, was quite literally Jimmy Carter saved America.
I mean, what is America if it's not our natural treasures? So he did all that. And, it's really, nobody talks about, when they talk about Carter and when they talk about what's happening now, I don't hear people saying, like, you know what, ironically or coincidentally or something, all of the things that are being dismantled and are being targeted right now, they're actually Jimmy Carter initiatives. The Department of Education, he created it. They're trying to dismantle it. The Department of Energy, he created it. They want to dismantle it. The Park Service, he essentially built half of it. One guy in 4 years built half of the parks that we have. Think about that. I mean, even Roosevelt, who preserved more land, not much more than Carter, he had 4 years in which to do it. And he was living in a time of conservation ethic and, where conservatives, as Roosevelt was, Republicans recognized that conserving our land was the thing to do. We didn't even have the capacity to do the kind of extraction, polluting that was going on in the 70s and since then. But Carter in 4 years doubled that, single-handedly built that park system. So, and others followed him. I mean, his use of the Antiquities Act, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, they extended that to our oceanic, and created all sorts of monuments underwater in these amazing saltwater environments that were protected. And these are bipartisan sort of recognition that preserving our natural resources is the greatest thing we can do for our current and future generations. So I could get on a soapbox about it.
Well, buddy, let me tell you something. Jim, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. This book is phenomenal. Like I said, I really, truly, in my heart, believe it's time for a critical reappraisal of Jimmy Carter, the man. Jimmy Carter's America, because I feel like, boy, we could use some of that right now. So I am going to be continuing to shout to the rest of the world to go out and get a copy of this because I think it's phenomenal. Where are you fishing next?
Well, we're about to start having the flood tides here right behind my house where the redfish come up into the marsh grass. So.
Flood tides, I said redfish.
But yeah, we'll be doing a good bit of that. And then we like to, the boys and I like to fish up in North Carolina, eastern North Carolina for trout. I tell you what, if you will indulge me speaking about Carter, this is a quote, one of my favorite quotes from one of his books. There are a lot of his quotes in our book, but I'd like to, leave leave our listeners with Carter's own words, because I think they're very prescient. This was from one of my favorite books of it. He wrote 32 different books. He was, one of the most prolific writers.
I don't know how the man slept.
I know. And he just won a Grammy posthumously for spoken word, and that was like his 9th spoken word Grammy that he received or something like that. Don't quote me on the numbers, but a lot of Grammys. But the last book that he wrote is called Faith, A Journey for All. He was 95 years old when he wrote that book. I will say, to plug our book, the proudest thing I have about it is he wrote all those books, and he wrote his speeches, and he spoke a lot of them off the cuff. He was a man of words,
Mm-hmm.
We don't have many of those in politics anymore either. His words were incredibly eloquent, and he didn't rely on speechwriters or ghostwriters. He wrote his own words. But the last thing he ever wrote was the foreword to our book. And I take a lot of pride in that. If nobody ever read it but us, the last thing he ever wrote was a foreword. And it's a short one. He wrote 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph is about his friend Carlton, but the last paragraph is about his relationship to me. So I just am so proud of the fact that the last thing he ever wrote was about me. Anyway, this is from Faith, A Journey to All. I just liked it. I would highly recommend that book. Read it instead of our book. But he said,
read both.
Yeah, keep reading. Read any book you can get your hands on. He said, what are the goals of a person or a denomination or a country? They are remarkably the same: a desire for peace, a need for humility, for examining one's faults and turning away from them, a commitment to human rights in the broadest sense of the words, based on a moral society concerned with the alleviation of suffering because of deprivation or hatred or hunger or physical affliction, and a willingness, even an eagerness, to share one's ideals, one's faith with others, to translate love in a person into justice. We could use a lot more of that. Right.
I couldn't agree more. Jim, talking to you today about one of my favorite people. That's been an honor,
well,
man.
Thanks
Thank
for
you so
having
much
me.
for taking the time.
I've enjoyed it. I love your podcasts.
Thank you very much, sir. All right, everybody. This was Jim Barger Jr. The book is Jimmy Carter, Rivers and Dreams, Rods, Reels, and Peace Deals, plus the one that got away. Go get it right now. It's the right thing to do. So, catch you guys a little bit later.